The Galactic Preservation Protocol was, in the considered opinion of approximately 7,000 member species, an absolute masterpiece of interstellar legislation. It protected endangered ecosystems, prevented colonial exploitation, and ensured that pristine worlds remained pristine for future generations to observe from a comfortable distance through high-resolution cameras. The protocol was so thoroughly comprehensive that it covered everything from atmospheric composition monitoring to the precise shade of beige that observation facilities could be painted. What it did not cover, rather ironically, was what happened when someone actually ended up stuck on one of these protected worlds without their carefully portioned, nutritionally balanced, entirely synthetic meal packets. Verdania 7 was one such protected world. A lush paradise of towering forests, crystalline streams, and meadows that stretched toward horizons painted in colors most species needed extra photoreceptors to fully appreciate. It was classified as a Class A preservation zone, which meant absolutely no interference with local ecosystems, no sample collection, no interaction with wildlife, and certainly no consumption of native resources. The penalties for violations started at severe and escalated quickly to ruinous. The Ranger Corps, assigned to patrol these zones, took their duties with the kind of seriousness usually reserved for defusing antimatter bombs or negotiating with hive collectives. The Rangers were excellent at their jobs. Perhaps too excellent. Which was how, on a completely routine day that would become decidedly non-routine, they discovered an unauthorized expedition team whose supply shuttle had experienced what the pilot diplomatically called a catastrophic navigation recalibration, and everyone else called, "You flew us into a tree, you idiot." The team had crash-landed approximately 40 kilometers from the nearest authorized zone boundary. They would need at least 3 standard days for rescue to arrive. They had emergency rations for those 3 days. Had. Past tense. Because the Rangers confiscated every single nutritional packet, Protocol 7, subsection 43, the lead ranger, a Vrexian, whose name translated roughly to unyielding purpose of regulatory compliance, announced with the emotional inflection of someone reading a recycling bin instruction manual, "No foreign organic matter may be introduced to the preservation zone that could potentially contaminate the local ecosystem through waste products." "We are going to starve," shrieked Kesix, a Tholan whose crystalline body structure was already dimming from stress. The Tholans were a species that had evolved past biological eating entirely, but they still required energy supplements every 30 hours or faced systemic shutdown. Kesix supplements were currently in the Ranger's confiscation container. "We have water purification tablets," the Ranger replied, consulting a datapad. "You may consume water from approved sources. A list of approved water sources has been transmitted to your communicators." "Water," repeated Vrool, a Hectarian whose 4 stomachs were already growling in harmony. "Just water. For 3 days, compliance is appreciated," the Ranger said, which was either encouragement or a threat. With Rangers, it was genuinely difficult to tell. The expedition team watched in collective despair as the Rangers loaded their emergency supplies onto a hover cart and departed, presumably to file the incident in triplicate, while the team slowly died of hunger. The group consisted of 8 beings from 7 different species, all scientists on what was supposed to be a simple atmospheric study from orbit. None of them had training in wilderness survival. Most of them had never actually touched dirt before this moment. Their collective experience with natural environments extended to carefully curated botanical gardens and the occasional nature documentary, always viewed from the safety of temperature-controlled facilities. Most of them, anyway. Marcus Reeves was having the best day he had experienced in approximately 6 months. While his colleagues dissolved into panic spirals and began composing farewell messages to their breeding pods, Marcus was studying the tree line with the expression of someone who had just been told the buffet was free and unlimited. He was a human, which several of the team members had considered an odd choice for a highly technical expedition, but humans had this peculiar knack for squeezing themselves into every conceivable corner of the galaxy. Something about being aggressively social primates with excellent pattern recognition and a truly unreasonable tolerance for risk. "We are going to die," Kesix announced to no one in particular, their crystalline structure flickering with distress patterns. "Unlikely," Marcus said absently, poking at something green growing near a tree root. "We have no food, no sustenance, no energy sources. I mean, that is objectively incorrect, but sure, panic is a valid response." Marcus pulled up the green thing, which turned out to have a bulbous white root attached. He brushed off the dirt, sniffed it, made a considering sound, and bit off a small piece of the root. He chewed thoughtfully while 7 pairs of eyes watched in mounting horror. "Did you just eat the ground?" Vrul asked weakly. "Technically, I ate something that was growing in the ground." Important distinction. Marcus smiled and tucked the plant into his jacket pocket. "Wild onion, or something very similar. Bit more peppery than earth varieties, but definitely edible. The sulfur compounds are slightly different, probably due to soil composition variations, but the basic structure is close enough. You cannot possibly know that from one bite. I mean, if I am wrong, I will definitely know in about 20 minutes when my digestive system stages a violent protest. But I have consumed approximately 400 species of plants across 30 worlds and only been hospitalized twice, so I am reasonably confident in my pattern recognition." He glanced around the clearing with the assessing gaze of a predator, which was uncomfortable because humans were not supposed to be predators, except everyone seemed to forget they absolutely were. "Give me an hour, maybe 2. Try not to compose any death poetry in the meantime. It is terrible for morale." Marcus wandered toward the forest with the casual confidence of someone going to the market rather than potentially poisoning himself in an alien wilderness. The rest of the team exchanged glances, attempted to establish consensus on what to do, failed because consensus building required energy they did not have, and eventually just sat down to wait for either rescue or death, whichever came first. 40 minutes later, Marcus had not died. This was encouraging. He had, however, disappeared completely into the forest, which was less encouraging. Kesix was oscillating between transparent and opaque with stress. Vrul had attempted to file a formal complaint about the Ranger Corps through the emergency channel and been informed that the complaint office hours were currently closed. A Silithan engineer named Drex had calculated their exact caloric deficit and concluded they would begin experiencing system failures in approximately 43 hours. The calculations were extremely precise and extremely depressing. Then Marcus emerged from the tree line carrying his jacket bundled up like a sack. He looked absurdly pleased with himself, like a child who had just discovered where the cookies were hidden. "Good news," he announced, dropping his jacket bundle in the center of the group. Various green things spilled out, along with what appeared to be mushrooms, some kind of berries, and several roots of different colors. "This planet is delicious. That is plant matter," Kesix said, as if Marcus might not have noticed. "Outstanding observation skills. Yes, these are plants. These are edible plants. This is food. We are scientists, not scavengers." I mean, those are not mutually exclusive categories, but all right. Marcus started sorting his collection into piles with the kind of organization that suggested he had done this many times before. These are similar to dandelion greens, bitter but nutritious and packed with vitamins. These mushrooms are not the same species as anything on Earth, but they have the same spore pattern as chanterelles, so probably safe. These berries are definitely from the rubus genus, or close enough that my translator is giving up, which means they are almost certainly fine. And these roots are going to need cooking, but they look like a cross between a potato and a sweet potato, so that is carbohydrates sorted. Drex leaned closer, fascination overriding hunger. You identified all of these through visual pattern matching alone, and smell, and a tiny bit of tasting. Mostly pattern matching though. Humans are exceptional at pattern matching. It is our whole thing. Well, that and throwing objects with alarming accuracy, but there is nothing to throw at right now. Marcus pulled out a small knife from his boot. Several team members flinched. Relax. This is a tool, not a weapon. I am going to set some snares. Snares, Vrul repeated, all four of his stomachs suddenly feeling uneasy for reasons unrelated to hunger. Primitive traps for catching small animals. This forest has game trails everywhere. Where there are trails, there are animals. Where there are animals, there is protein. The team stared at him with the collective expression of people watching someone casually announce they were about to commit what was technically a war crime. You are planning to kill animals, Keswick said slowly. I am planning to eat animals. The killing is just an intermediate step. Marcus was already walking toward the forest edge again, examining the ground with the intensity of someone reading a fascinating novel. Humans are omnivores. We eat plants and animals, sometimes simultaneously. It is very efficient. That is barbaric. That is survival. Marcus crouched near what was indeed a small trail through the underbrush, barely visible to eyes not trained to spot such things. Look, I understand that most of your species evolved past predation millennia ago. You have protein synthesizers and nutrient paste, and very strong opinions about the ethics of consuming living things. But humans, we were chasing down prey animals before we invented language. We cooked meat over fire before we figured out agriculture. This is not barbarism. This is literally in our genetic code. He started bending a flexible branch into a loop, using fibrous strips from a plant to create cordage. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, the kind that came from doing something hundreds of times. The team watched in fascinated silence as he constructed something that looked like it belonged in a primitive history museum, set it carefully along the trail, and camouflaged it with leaves. How long before something gets caught? Drex asked. Could be an hour. Could be tomorrow. Animals are not precisely punctual. Marcus set up 2 more snares at different locations, then returned to the clearing. In the meantime, we should prepare everything else. I need stones for a fire ring, the flattest area you can clear, and someone to stop looking at me like I am about to start sacrificing people to ancient gods. Keswick dimmed further. You are going to create uncontrolled combustion. I am going to cook food. Yes, that requires fire. Unless you would prefer to eat everything raw, which honestly I do not recommend for the tubers. The rangers will detect the smoke. The rangers confiscated our food and left us to die. I am not particularly concerned about their opinions on my cooking methods. Marcus started gathering deadfall wood, selecting pieces with the care of someone who knew exactly what would burn properly. Besides, a small fire with dry wood produces minimal smoke. We are not signaling passing spacecraft. We are sautéing vegetables. The absurdity of the situation was beginning to penetrate the hunger fog. Vrul found himself helping to clear the ground, using his 4 arms to efficiently move rocks into a circle while Marcus arranged kindling. Drex collected more deadfall, his engineering mind appreciating the structural logic of how Marcus stacked the wood. Even Keswiks, despite constant verbal protests, used their energy fields to help clear the area of debris. Marcus produced another tool from his seemingly endless pockets, this one a fire starter that worked on friction and sparks rather than technology. Within minutes, he had a small controlled fire burning cheerfully in the rock ring. He arranged the tubers at the edge of the coals, wrapped the mushrooms in large leaves and placed them near the heat, and started preparing the greens with his knife. The smell started almost immediately. Something between roasting nuts and caramelizing sugar, earthy and rich, and completely unlike anything that came from a nutritional paste dispenser. It was the smell of chemistry happening in real time, complex carbohydrates breaking down into sugars, proteins, denaturing and developing new flavor compounds, volatile aromatics being released into the air. That is an odor, Keswick said. But they had drifted closer to the fire. That is cooking, Marcus corrected. One of humanity's greatest inventions, right up there with written language and trash talk. Vrool's stomachs growled loudly enough that several small creatures fled from nearby bushes. What does it taste like? Significantly better than starvation, I can promise you that much. Marcus turned the tubers with a stick. Real food has this quality that synthesized nutrition just cannot match. Complexity, variation, the sense that you are eating something that was alive and grew and existed in an ecosystem. Nutrition paste is fuel. This is an experience. An hour passed. The tubers were cooked through, soft and steaming when Marcus split them open with his knife. The mushrooms had released their moisture and concentrated their flavors. The leaves they were wrapped in charred around the edges. The greens had been briefly heated to reduce their bitterness. Marcus arranged everything on broad leaves like plates and distributed them to the group with the solemnity of someone serving a feast at a state dinner. I cannot believe I am doing this, Vrool muttered, but he was already lifting a piece of tuber to his mouth. The taste was incredible, not because it was gourmet cuisine prepared by master chefs with rare ingredients, but because it was real. The tuber had a sweet, nutty flavor with a creamy texture that somehow felt more substantial than anything from a synthesizer. The mushrooms were meaty and umami-rich, with an earthiness that tasted like the forest itself. Even the bitter greens had a peppery complexity that actually complemented everything else. After days of nutritional paste, after the stress of the crash, after the despair of confiscation, this simple meal tasted like the finest restaurant in the galaxy. This is acceptable, Keswick admitted, which from a Tholan was practically a declaration of love. Drex was already reaching for seconds. How did humans discover which plants were safe to eat? Trial and error. Mostly error. Lots of error. Humans died figuring this out. Marcus bit into a mushroom, but the knowledge accumulated. We learned what made us sick, what killed us, what nourished us. We shared that information. We passed it down through oral traditions and written records, and eventually genetic memory. Eventually we knew enough to survive almost anywhere. Your species learned through mass casualties. Vrool looked horrified. Our species learned through necessity. When the options are experiment or starve, you experiment. Marcus poked at the fire, adding another piece of wood. Most species in the galaxy never faced that. You evolved on abundant worlds, or you developed technology before you faced real scarcity, or you were uplifted by someone else who gave you the answers. Humans, we had ice ages and droughts, and predators and parasites, and approximately 10,000 things trying to kill us at any given moment. We learned to look at the world and see resources instead of obstacles. A sharp snap echoed from the forest. Marcus was on his feet instantly, moving toward one of his snare locations with surprising speed for someone who had been sitting casually moments before. He returned carrying something that looked like a cross between a rabbit and a squirrel, already deceased from the snare's mechanism. The animal was small, probably no more than 2 kilograms, with soft grey fur and a bushy tail. Several team members looked away. "Protein," Marcus announced simply. He started processing the animal with clinical efficiency, which was somehow worse than if he had been gleeful about it. This was just practical, matter of fact. The actions of someone who had done this enough times that it was simply another task, like calibrating an instrument or filing a report. 20 minutes later, the meat was cooking over the fire on an improvised spit made from green wood that would not burn easily, and the smell was even better than the vegetables had been. Rich and savory, with hints of whatever the animal had been eating translated into flavor. Marcus rotated it carefully, watching for even cooking, occasionally adding herbs from his foraged collection to the outside. "I should not want this," Keswick said quietly. "My species has not consumed biological matter in 3,000 years. Your species has not been stranded without energy supplements in 3,000 years either," Marcus replied. "Civilization is wonderful right up until it is not there anymore. Then you remember why your ancestors developed all those primitive skills in the first place." When the meat was ready, Marcus divided it just like he had divided the vegetables, offered it with the same casual confidence, and one by one, the team members tried it. Even Keswick, who absorbed a tiny portion through direct energy conversion just to taste it. The meal continued as the sun began setting, painting the sky in colors that their cameras would never quite capture properly. They ate and talked, conversations drifting from survival to philosophy, to the fundamental question of what it meant to be a civilized species. Marcus argued that civilization was not about distance from nature, but about choosing how to interact with it. Vrool suggested that perhaps humans had never truly left their primitive origins behind, and maybe that was not actually a bad thing. Drex wondered if other species had lost something essential when they abandoned their connection to the physical world. Keswick, who had been quiet for a while, finally said, "This is the best meal I have consumed in 300 years. It is a bunch of foraged plants and a small mammal cooked over an open fire," Marcus pointed out. "Yes, that is why it is the best." The fire burned down to coals. The team, no longer in immediate danger of starvation, actually relaxed for the first time since the crash. They arranged themselves around the fire ring, using their emergency blankets for warmth, now that the Rangers had thoughtfully left those behind. The forest around them was alive with nocturnal sounds, no longer threatening but simply present. Somewhere in the distance, something howled, a long melodic sound that was answered by others farther away. The team instinctively moved closer together, but Marcus just smiled. "Night chorus," he said. "They are establishing territory, not hunting. How can you tell?" Drex asked. "Different vocalizations for different purposes. Hunting calls are shorter, sharper. These are social. They are just letting each other know where they are." Marcus took first watch, though watch for what was unclear since they were probably the most dangerous things in this particular section of forest. He added wood to the fire occasionally, kept the coals alive, and generally looked like someone on a pleasant camping trip rather than an emergency survival situation. Dawn arrived with bird-like creatures singing complex harmonies that Drex immediately wanted to record for analysis. The team woke to find Marcus already cooking breakfast, more foraged greens, and the remainder of the meat from the previous night, reheated and served with some kind of purple fruit he had apparently collected before anyone else was awake. "How are you not exhausted?" Vrool asked through a yawn. "I am having the time of my life," Marcus replied cheerfully. Do you understand how rare it is to get permission to practice wilderness survival on a completely pristine world? The rangers would never allow this under normal circumstances. This is basically a vacation. We crashed. The rangers stole our food. We nearly starved. Sure, if you focus on the negatives. Marcus handed over a portion of breakfast. I prefer to see it as an opportunity for cultural exchange and practical education. You have learned that humans can eat basically anything. I have learned that Tholans can absorb energy from cooked food if they really try. Everyone grows. The sound of approaching hover vehicles interrupted the conversation. The rangers had returned right on schedule, probably expecting to find a group of desperate, weakened scientists ready to file violations and lawsuits. Instead, they found the expedition team finishing breakfast around a campfire, looking healthier than when the rangers had left them. Unyielding purpose of regulatory compliance stopped at the edge of the clearing, sensory stalks twitching in confusion. You appear to have obtained food. Obtained is a strong word. Marcus said, we utilized available resources in accordance with basic survival principles. You consumed native plant life. We consumed plants that were already dead or dying, fruits that had fallen, greens that were growing in abundance. We took no rare specimens, damaged no unique ecosystems, and actually probably helped with seed dispersal through our waste products, which I am happy to explain in detail if you would like. The ranger's stalks twitched faster. You killed a native animal. One animal, a common species based on the trail density and population indicators. Again, happy to provide detailed ecological impact assessment if needed. Marcus gestured to the fire ring. We also practiced responsible fire management, used only deadfall for fuel, and will completely dismantle this site before departing. We have probably left less impact than your hover vehicle just did landing. In fact, I would argue that your vehicle disturbed more soil and disrupted more wildlife than our entire 3-day stay. Unyielding purpose of regulatory compliance consulted their datapad with increasing agitation, presumably searching for the specific regulation that covered stranded scientists becoming temporarily indigenous. They would not find one. The protocol was comprehensive, but it had been written by species who could not imagine actually surviving on a preserved world without supply chains. The idea that someone might just eat what was available had apparently never occurred to the drafters. This is highly irregular, the ranger finally said, which was ranger speak for having absolutely no idea what to do. This is humanity, Marcus replied, and began offering the rangers some of the leftover breakfast, because apparently hospitality was also hardwired into human behavior, even when dealing with people who had literally left you to die. The rangers declined, loaded the team onto their transport, and spent the entire flight back to the authorized zone filing supplementary reports about the incident. The expedition team spent the flight digesting actual food and reconsidering their assumptions about primitive versus advanced capabilities. 3 days later, back in the climate-controlled comfort of the orbital station, Kesix filed a request to join Marcus on his next assignment. Vrool began researching human culinary history and was shocked to discover just how much of human culture revolved around food acquisition and preparation. Drex started a controversial paper suggesting that post-biological species might benefit from occasionally remembering their biological origins. And Marcus was already planning his next camping trip, because apparently nearly dying in the wilderness was not a deterrent but an invitation. Humans had spent millions of years learning to survive in a world that wanted them dead. A little thing like galactic regulations was not going to make them forget how. The Galactic Preservation Protocol remained unchanged, still protecting pristine worlds from interference, still preventing exploitation and contamination. But somewhere in the supplementary appendices, buried in subsection annotations that almost nobody read, there was now a small note about humans and their peculiar ability to find food in places where food should not exist. The note was flagged for further study. Nobody was quite sure what to study. Exactly. How do you regulate a species that treats restriction as a creative challenge? How do you preserve nature from beings who see themselves as part of nature rather than separate from it? How do you write rules for people who view obstacles as puzzles to be solved rather than barriers to be respected? The answer, much like Marcus's foraging techniques, would require more observation, preferably from a safe distance, and absolutely not during meal times, because watching humans eat things they found on the ground remained deeply unsettling to species who had spent millennia perfecting their nutritional paste formulas. Civilization, it turned out, was not about forgetting how to survive. It was about having the choice not to. And humans, characteristically contrary, chose to remember anyway, just in case the universe decided to test them again, which, given the universe's track record, was less an if and more a when.